So we continue our program with a second keynote address by a colleague from Kyiv, Daria Kaleniuk. She is Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kyiv, which is a quite powerful national organization that has shaped Ukraine's anti-corruption legislation efforts. As we have heard in the last panels, these internal efforts of countries in the process of EU accession is very important, and this is one of the important aspects of this accession process. So Daria's organization ensured that Ukraine's elected parliament designed strong anti-corruption legislation, including the laws on the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and other courts. She also founded critical resources to track money laundering and corruption internationally. And since Russia's large-scale war launched against Ukraine, jointly with others, she co-founded this International Center of Ukraine Victory, headquartered in Poland. And as you see from the title, this is probably the most optimistic title we have in the seminar, Reforming Ukraine During the War and After Military Victory. So the floor is yours. Thanks for coming and looking forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start with some energizer after the lunch, which was great. It's important. I will read you a quote from one leader, and I will ask you to guess whose quote is that and when this quote was given. There is no independent court in Ukraine. On the demand of Western partners, Kyiv authorities provided crucial role to representatives of international organizations to select senior judicial agencies, High Qualification Commission of Judges and High Council of Justice. Through its embassy, the US controls National Anti-Corruption Prevention Commission, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, and High Anti-Corruption Court. They are doing this allegedly to fight corruption. Okay, so where are the results? Corruption is flourishing even more than before. Are the Ukrainians aware of these methods of governance? Do they understand that their country is not even under economic or political protection, but is being treated as a colony with a puppet regime? It's a quote of a leader of one country. Who would want to guess whose quote is that? I have a small present. Ukrainian chevron. Bingo. When this quote was given, do you have a second prize? We can negotiate about that. Putin. This is the quote of Vladimir Putin. He mentioned every single anti-corruption institution Ukraine was working since 2014. And he mentioned these institutions in the details that even Ukrainians don't have. He named institutions like High Qualification Commission of Judges and High Council of Justice. Try to repeat it. This speech was given on February 21, 2022, 3 days before the large-scale invasion. I was listening to this speech in my apartment in Kyiv on February 21. I just returned from Austria, from the Munich Security Conference, where there was still a discussion within our team, is it going to be an invasion or not? But we were preparing the contingency plan anyway. We were alerted that most likely some of leaders of our organization are in the kill list of Russians, and our partners from the US and from Ukrainian government just alerted us that they better stay somewhere away from Ukraine. Do not return. But on February 21st, when I heard this speech in my kitchen in Kyiv, I understood that it's a declaration of war speech. It was much longer than just this quote. And it was full of anger and commitment of Putin to punish Ukraine for its decision to live free, in dignity, and according to the values which are in the Western liberal world. He wants slaves. He doesn't want to have really independent individuals, even in the neighborhood of Russia. So, all these reforms were a threat for Putin because he could lose possibility to control Ukraine. He actually lost possibility to control Ukraine from inside. Using all the strategic corruption tools and means he tried to employ and tried to use since, I don't know, probably his election, since 2001. Energy wars, embedding their agents in top state-controlled institutions, companies, buying judges for any decision which are needed to ensure that oligarchs controlled by Putin have critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So all those means and tools were used by Kremlin to keep control over Ukraine from inside. But he failed. Because of these strong institutions which we built in Ukraine, because of the joint commitment of reformers in government and civil society organizations, because of close partnership with the EU, with the IMF, we actually started to build very strong, independent rule of law institutions in Ukraine. And that was one of the reasons, I think, why Putin decided to destroy Ukraine militarily through the large-scale invasion, to punish us for our decision to be free and live in dignity. All those institutions which we were able to build, which are safeguarding rule of law and which guarantee accountability and transparency, was the result of the joint cooperation, as I mentioned, of civil society, of government, but also of our joint cooperation with EU and IMF. IMF, when they arrived in 2014, had the list of conditionalities for Ukraine to implement, and they consulted with us, with civil society. What is possible to implement so that to ensure that the money which we are lending to Ukraine, they are not stolen? And we told them, because we already existed as anti-corruption organization, we had partners also in the field. We told them what reforms are doable, where are the tricks could be in their implementation, and they listened to us. Then included these recommendations into the official conditionalities of IMF. The same the EU has done. We've had the Visa Liberalization Action Plan on the way for Ukraine and Ukrainians to travel freely to Europe. We had to implement important reforms. And we talked to European Commission, we talked to capitals, EU member states, about what is realistic to implement in Ukraine. And they listened to us. So these recommendations became the part of the Visa Liberalization Action Plan. Important anti-corruption and rule of law obligations. And despite unwillingness of Ukrainian elites back in 2015, 2016, 2018 to implement these reforms, we've succeeded. We've done them. What is happening after large-scale invasion? Did we stop to implement the reforms? High Anti-Corruption Court was the only court which was functioning in April 2022 in Kyiv, hearing cases. In April 22, when there are still Russian occupiers near Irpin, near Bucha, High Anti-Corruption Court was operational. National Anti-Corruption Bureau detectives were helping our intelligence services to identify where Russian troops are. Part of them enlisted into the armed forces, but still the majority of them stayed and reopened their active investigations in May 2022. But the largest blessing for us was an event which happened in June 2022. This is the decision of our allies, of our partners from the EU, to grant us EU candidacy status. That was such a hope for the entire nation, the hope for future, that after the war, after the victory, we will finally live in a dignity and we will be separated forever from this evil, which is called, it shouldn't be called even Russia, it is Moscovia. And we were blessed as civil society because EU decided to link this decision to 7 recommendations. The decision was given for the EU candidacy status and 7 recommendations, 5 of which are in relation to rule of law, were the guideline for all Ukrainian government for the next steps and reforms on the way towards the EU. As my colleague Veronika Mauchand mentioned, almost all of these recommendations are implemented. We've had obstacles, but we are watchdogging every step, a civil society of our government, when they are trying to cheat, where they are trying to use some previous ways and means how to implement recommendations. So we can see what are the obstacles towards having really strong reforms. But nevertheless, recommendation number 1, the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office was appointed. Recommendation number 2, the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine was selected by the Independent Selection Commission. He's not the best candidate, but he's also not the worst candidate. We've given him a chance to show how he can perform. The judicial reform, which Putin mentioned in his speech, which is the declaration of war speech, is at its final stage. So these complex words, High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges, which are actually self-governance institutions of the judicial entire branch of power, they are almost formed. And they are about to start the cleaning up of all judiciary of Ukraine, which includes also hiring new judges. We have about 2,000 vacancies of judges in Ukraine. Constitutional Court, less progress here. The government tried to cheat. The law was adopted, but not according to the recommendations of the Venice Commission and of the EU. We communicated that immediately to the people of Ukraine. We said, listen, members of parliament and president, who is obviously the hero, but he has the majority in the parliament, they are not implementing this recommendation properly. So if anything happens in the EU regarding lack of decision of EU integration, this will be the parliamentarians who are in charge for deciding on the proper law. And then the EU joined and communicated clearly that there shouldn't be excuse, there shouldn't be soft implementation. There have to be tough love. There has to be pressure that we are implementing the conditionalities in a proper way. And now there's a draft law in the parliament to repair the law, which is not in line with the constitution, with the Venice Commission. And I'm pretty confident that we will have the good law and constitutional court where we will select the judges according to the competitive procedures, and they will safeguard our rule of law and our constitution for the years ahead. So all that is happening despite the war. Whether there is no corruption in Ukraine? No, there is corruption in Ukraine. But we in Ukraine are admitting that. We are saying, yes, there is a problem in Ukraine, and we are working on this problem. We are solving this problem while fighting the largest conventional war in Europe since World War II. We admit the problem. But we are not the most corrupt country of the world, as Putin is trying to present Ukraine. He was trying to do that and almost succeeded. We are not the most corrupt country in Europe. No. There is nothing in media about corruption in Belarus. Zero information about corruption in Belarus. There is no corruption in Belarus? Zero of information now about corruption in Russia. Is there no corruption in Russia? The point I'm trying to make is that if there are tools and means for civil society to expose corruption, and if there are tools and means for independent government institutions to punish for corruption, it means that we are on the right track, that we are progressing, that we are cleaning up our house. And we are committed to do that because we know that it's part of our existential survival. It's part of our theory of victory. I'm supposed to talk about reform in Ukraine during the war and after military victory. And I present myself for the last year as an anti-corruption activist who is advocating for weapons. But in our vision of victory, first, obviously, we have to kick Russians out of Ukraine, of all of our territories as of 1991. Second, we have to prevent them from attacking us again. And for that reason, we need to become the NATO members. Third, we have to make Russia pay for all the damage. The damage which Russia made in Ukraine is irreparable because human lives, which we lost, cannot be returned. But the economical damage, they must pay. And we can start with $350 billion of Russian sovereign money, which are placed across the Western liberal democracies. We should start with the EU finally making up the way how to confiscate this money. We should start with EU member states, at least each EU member state, to say how much of this Russian money was seized, of both sovereign money and money which belonged to the oligarchs. And this is the source of money which we are hoping for to be used as the first money for reconstruction of Ukraine and for repairing all the damage. But we ask for your help to find the legal tools and solutions, political courage to get it done, so that we are not reliant just on the taxpayers of the EU member states. Ukrainians don't want to be beggars. We want the guy and the group of people who are residing in the Kremlin to pay for what they've done. We want accountability. We want a tribunal as well. It's part of our victory. And part of our victory is the EU integration. Today, at the previous panels, there were discussions what Ukraine could bring on the table in the EU. I pretty much support everything what was said. But what I would add, that Ukraine could and will bring security. Ukraine will win this war with the largest combat experienced army in Europe. If Europe wants to be safe and not reliant on somebody else to protect the European continent, Ukraine, with its large army and combat-ready army, must be as part of the EU and NATO. Otherwise, we will have a huge country on the borders of the EU with 1 million of people with combat experience and with lots of weapons. Without hope to have future in the EU and NATO, all this gray zone will transform into the big bomb right on the neighborhood of the EU. And now about the victory. Whether we will have militarily victory, we're not sure. But Ukrainians will fight to the last bullet. Because we understand that the intent of Russia, of Kremlin, is still there. And their intent is to eliminate us from existence. Eliminate Ukrainians as a nation, Ukrainians as a people, and Ukraine as a state. They don't want us to exist in the map. They don't want us to exist in the history. They don't want us to exist in the culture. Because we are a threat to their autocratic, even totalitarian system now. Putin is saying that Ukraine is kind of alternative to Russia. Yes, we are alternative to Russia. But we are also a vaccine against Russian imperialism. And the defeat of Russia will give hope not only to Ukraine, but it will give some hope to Russians themselves. I don't believe they will change fast, because this is the society sick on imperialism. They believe in chauvinism. This is the way of their thinking. The way of finding greatness for them is to oppress other people, other nations. They failed to find the source of importance and greatness inside themselves. It's a lot of psychology which will be needed in order for Russian people to have chance for something different. And yesterday, the former president of Estonia and Slovakia told that the victory in Ukraine and the victory of liberal world in this war will be at the moment when Russian children in their schools will have access to the education and will be learning what their country has done to Chechnya, to Syria, to Georgia, to Ukraine, to Belarus. This is the moment when there will be hope in Russia. I don't know whether it will happen. Honestly, I don't care a lot. I don't have much hope for Russians. But if there is a chance for them, the only option is defeat in Ukraine. But we should also talk about alternative scenario, which has direct impact on Europe and how Europe will look like, how EU will look like. Is Ukraine losing? And I disagree with Misha Gleny that there is something in between. Freezing, seizure, conflict. Because seizure of conflict, something like Minsk III, is equal to Ukraine losing. And I will explain why. The war is happening at Ukrainian territory. The damage to critical infrastructure is happening at Ukrainian territory. We are losing our people. The demographic situation is very bad. I doubt we have 30 million of people, honestly, now in Ukraine. Considering how many left, and these are women with children, this is our future, and considering all those people who are now fighting in the trenches, who were killed, who were wounded. And if we will be forced to the ceasefire, and I know that there are some capitals, both in Europe and through Atlantic, who are eager to encourage to that. If martial law will be lifted, and if there will be no hope for EU and NATO membership, no hope that Russia will stop bombarding Ukraine every single night, these women with kids will not return to Ukraine. And men, when martial law will be lifted, will leave Ukraine. Because it's a hard choice for every mother with a kid. I'm a mother with 2 sons. One is 11, another is 6. And I have to decide. Where should be their future? In Ukraine? Or somebody in Europe? I can bring them to any country in Europe. I can find a job. They can have the great education. If I'm bringing them to Kyiv, they have to go to school and to the kindergarten when there are air raids. They have to hide in the bomb shelters. During the winter, where there is no electricity because of Russia is attacking deliberately our critical infrastructure, they can't go to school to have offline schooling, and they can't have online schooling. So if I am bringing them to Ukraine, I'm depriving my kids from education. So if I'm bringing my kids to Ukraine, I'm a horrible mom. And I am. My kids are now in Ukraine. And I want every single mother who left Ukraine to have the decision be much less painful than mine. I want them to know and be reassured that they can return safely and there will be no Russian bombs. And for that reason, we need NATO membership. We will not win and survive in a long term as a country. There will be no real reconstruction if there will be no security guarantees. Not assurances as we had under the Budapest Memorandum. Not promises, but legal obligations. And we will pay back. Our people are very thankful to every nation which is with us during these horrible times. And our soldiers who have combat experience will be ready to protect every nation which will be under their aggression. And we have a lot to share in terms of how to fight Russian disinformation, how to fight Russian propaganda, how to fight Russian psychological attacks, how to fight corruption. I bet there is also corruption in Europe, in the EU. I bet. We don't hear a lot about that, but we also don't hear a lot about corruption in Belarus. I think there are different reasons why we don't hear about corruption in Belarus and corruption in Europe. But there is corruption. If we are not speaking about corruption, if we are not hearing about that, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And those transparency and accountability tools which we developed in Ukraine, I think are important to be adopted in EU, on the EU level. Transparency of political party financing, asset disclosure system of public officials, public registries of companies, of real estate. So all that is allowing citizens to expose malign influence, to expose dirty money, and to expose various totalitarian authoritarian regimes which are trying to undermine fair elections and democracy. So we indeed have a lot to suggest, but if we fail, and it's possible, and just for the simple reason, we might be out of people to fight. We might be out of soldiers. Time is not on our side. Time is on the side of Russia. Every day of delay of decisions of sending to Ukraine specific weapons or commitment of Europe and commitment of NATO and our partners into Ukrainian victory causes losses of lives of soldiers in trenches, causes more people wounded and in pain. What will happen to Belarus if Ukraine will lose? Belarus is under constant, soft, invisible occupation of Russia. The loss of Ukraine will allow Russia to finish this occupation completely. And the military of Belarus will be the military of Russia. Nuclear power plants of Belarus will be nuclear power plants of Russia. And nuclear weapons of Russia will be in Belarus. Russia is already coming close to the EU. The border of Belarus means Baltic states, means Poland, will be very close to the empire of evil, which still exists, because it was not punished for all the crimes it committed during the 20th century. And this empire must undergo the same punishment which the Nazi regimes went through. Okay. What else should I say? My final message. Please assess what will mean for Austria, for the EU, the scenario of Ukraine losing and the scenario of Ukraine winning. We shouldn't wait for somebody else through Atlantic to assess that. Because it is war in Europe. And it's not only Ukrainian security. We are winning time for you to prepare, to learn on the mistakes, and also to change, to become stronger. And after victory of Ukraine, with the help of all the people from the free world, we will be much, much stronger together. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this very powerful talk and the optimism you gave on the victory of Ukraine. We do hope that this will be in place in a short time. So, my question would be, before going to the audience, well, once this has happened, and you talked about this rule of law and anti-corruption is taking place in Ukraine, where you see the other hurdles to become very soon members of the European Union, because there are many other chapters to be closed in the accession process and accession discussions. So where you see the most important other problems after the victory of Ukraine?
Well, again, we are not waiting until war is over. We are doing the homework and ready to do the homework. And the more precise and concise are the requirements from the EU for our next step of accession, for the negotiations, the more easier will be for us and for reformers in the government to implement these requirements. And the hardest areas which I see from the perspective of cutting oligarchic influence and from the perspective of changing the games for businesses is energy, sector and anti-monopoly committee and the way how antitrust legislation works. But it is important to have this clarity. It is important for the EU, once we deliver these 7 recommendations between, I don't know how to deliver the one which Hungarians suggested, the law on minorities. It was definitely the political game here, but 5 recommendations are in relation to rule of law. So once we deliver them, then we expect the EU to deliver. Then we expect EU leaders and citizens of EU and member states to encourage the leaders to come to the next step of negotiations. And I'm hearing that there will be a lot of hurdles, there will be a lot of problems, that Ukraine with this agricultural market will kind of be like an elephant, too big, and farmers from France or Poland will be not happy with that. But guys, change your agricultural policies. It is hard to change, we know, but we are doing that during the war. So you have time without air raids and missiles and soldiers in the trenches to change. Use this time to change. So everything is possible in Ukraine. All the reforms which are needed to be done could be done. And in Ukraine, it will be not just up to the government to get them done. It will be up to entire society to make sure we are delivering, because it's our existential need. It's about whether we will be or we will be extinct. 87% of Ukrainians trust the EU. 75% of Ukrainians believe that on the way to EU integration, we must do reforms. 65% of Ukrainians think that anti-corruption and rule of law reforms must be done on the way to the EU. So Ukrainian people are mature. We know that the process of entering the EU is not less important than actually the EU membership. So yeah, there will be hard sectors, but we'll deliver.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. Tomas Hečík, Central Bank of Austria. If there is such thing as a European unity in our homogeneous European approach, how do you expect this European stance to develop once the war is over? Let's suppose the war is over tomorrow. How do you think the EU unity will evolve, the unity of EU leaders? How will the relationship with Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine and European countries like France, Germany, but also Austria, Hungary, evolve once the war is over? Thank you.
A lot depends on how the war will be over. If it is Ukrainian victory, it's one thing. If it is Ukrainian losing or something in between, Minsk III agreements, which is also equal to losing, it will be another way. So if it will be Ukrainian losing, the influence of Russia will increase all across EU. Russia will win strategic posts to rebuild its economy, to rebuild its military sector, to find proper relationships with China, to mobilize and train more troops, to prepare their disinformation and psychological operations all across EU. They will focus a lot on dividing Europe. It will be their weapon. So I'm not sure the unity will stay. If Ukraine will win, it will be the joint victory. And it will be a huge, huge blow to Kremlin. The power structure in Kremlin will change. Not necessarily Putin will disappear, but Putin will definitely get less influence within the Kremlin power structure. with his ideas of Great Russia and imperialistic ideas. Those groups of influence who are motivated more with economic things, who are agreeing to lose in Ukraine if they will stay in power, they will have more influence. We've done the analysis of Kremlin power structure, and we see that if Ukraine loses, if, let's say, Russia wins strategic pause, they will increase asymmetric attacks. They will try to break unity of Europe. They will try to break transatlantic unity. They will have more time for their operations in Africa and in Latin America. And that's actually not a good scenario, because Putin will win more influence inside Kremlin. He will be more like Stalinist person. He still is, but with his Stalinistic way of view, he will prepare for the new war in Ukraine, but also much, much broader than just in Ukraine. Russian army also learned a lot. Yes, they've lost a lot of people. They don't care, honestly, whether it's 100,000 or 200,000. But they learned a lot. We shouldn't underestimate Russians and their army. So with all this knowledge and combat experience in Ukraine, after winning in Ukraine, they will prepare their troops for new invasions. There is very high likelihood of them to attack Baltic, despite they are in NATO. They will definitely go against Moldova. They will be coming closer and closer to the core of the EU, and not only EU. So if we want hope, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, we shouldn't give them the strategic pause and to let them strengthen. We have to win fast.
I fully understand your argument and your line, but honestly, there's not only total winning, the whole area losing, or Minsk 3 or 4. NATO membership would also be possible, like it was with Western Germany, when not the whole territory is not yet under NATO covering. So do you exclude any kind of solution that you don't give up, of course, your authority on Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk, but join NATO for the moment with maybe some of the areas not yet part of the Ukraine which would join NATO? Because I think the most important thing is, and I agree fully with you, to have security guarantees, and probably the best one are NATO, because I don't see any other security guarantees realistically. So wouldn't it be wise, of course, in an internal discussion, to say NATO is the most important thing you have, and EU membership, and the territorial question, are some of them may be open, or do you exclude that version?
It would be easier to answer this question if it was only about territorial. It's about people who live at the occupied territories. And they are being treated like in concentration camps. They are being tortured. Children are denied from their identity. They are forced to sing Russian anthem in the morning. Women are being raped. A lot of kids are relocated from occupied territories in the south to Crimea or to Russia, and again, they are forcefully adopted. All those who are resisting are being identified, and the more time we give them, Russians will simply eliminate everybody who is resisting, and what is even more scary, they are forcing Ukrainian men at the occupied territories to mobilize and fight for Russia. It's not about territories. It's about freeing our people. And Russia is acting according to the strategy of the Golden Horde. When Golden Horde occupied specific territory, they use the local population to attack and occupy the new territory. That's the reason why Russia is so big. And we shouldn't forget that Russia is the successor of the Golden Horde, and in the way how they actually behave and fight. So Crimea, like, I can't understand why Crimea is such a red box or red line for many people on the West and in Europe. Until Russia is in Crimea, Russia is controlling Black Sea. And until Russia is controlling Black Sea through their submarines, through their fighter jets, which are flying from Russian airports, they control grain. They control how many people in the world who are in hunger will receive food. And the UN Food Initiative calculated that out of the 350 million of people who are in the hunger in the world, 100 million are in the hunger because of the Russia's war in Ukraine, particularly because of the block of the Black Sea ports. 100 million. And this is 100 million who are potentially refugees to the EU. In Egypt, there could be hunger strikes. Egypt was the key destination of our grain. So, and again, there are Crimean Tatars, there are Ukrainians and Ukrainian youth who cannot say they are Ukrainians. There was a teenager a couple of weeks ago who was walking somewhere in Yalta or Sevastopol, and somebody recorded a video asking him, okay, are you afraid of Ukrainian counteroffensive? And he said, no, I'm waiting for it. We are for Ukraine. And the next 2 days, he was forced on public media to say apologies to Putin. So we have our children there. We just can't leave them. That's the point. And we can't let Russia to occupy territories through which they are bombing our cities and controlling our economy through the Black Sea ports blockage. So for us and for our military, Crimea is a must-have. And it's important to understand here as well, in Europe.
Okay, so many thanks for these thoughts and your
Thank you.
Japanese post.